In life, we're never only in one moment. We're worrying about the present, we're thinking about the past, we're thinking about the implications of what's going to happen. And passions imitate that because we think, this event is happening. This is what it means to me now, hundreds of years later, as a believer.
Things that are prominent in the synoptics are either downplayed or disappear completely in the Gospel of John. And it looks like John wants to make a whole different set of theological points and make the drama play out differently.
We picked the 1725 version of the St. John Passion because it is slightly different from that what you know. If you go to a concert today, you normally hear the version from 1724, 1749. And if you know Bach, you know every single measure, every movement, and you are actually not really surprised. And in this version, there are surprises. There is a different first movement, a different last movement, some different arias, and so listening to the 1725 version helps you to hear the entire piece in a completely different light and from a completely different angle.
Bach's first year in Leipzig, he did a rendering of the John Passion. In his second year, I guess he didn't quite have another one ready, so he recycled the John Passion from the first year, but made a number of substantial changes. The first version of it is very obsessed with Christology, whereas the second version, the 1725 version, is very focused on sin.
Although Bach just changed a few framing movements, the character is very different. It is interesting to see the difference between the opening movements from 1724 and 1725.
The 1724 version starts Herr, unser Herrscher, focused on God. And the 1725 one starts O Mensch, bewein, O humankind, bewail your great sins.
Bach opens the narrative with this reflection on the sins of the human beings. We are responsible for the death and for the suffering of Jesus Christ. And he actually says, you listener of the Passion, it is you that made this possible, what you're going to hear.
I started looking at the score of the St. John last summer, and then in the fall, the soloists began learning their roles, and then after Christmas, the choir, we got back together again, and they started learning their choruses in detail, week by week by week. And then the week before, in comes the players, Robert Mealy and the orchestra, and we then raced towards the dress rehearsal, which was in St. Mary's the day before the performance. I think everybody in the choir and in the orchestra invested a tremendous amount in preparing for this piece, but in particular the two main soloists, the Evangelist and Christus, took this piece to themselves, and they worked so hard at it, and they learnt it by heart, and they delivered it with a tremendous sense of the drama and the unfolding of the story.
I appreciated how in our performance, Derek, who sang the role of the evangelist, and I singing the role of Jesus, we began the Passion as members of the chorus, and we set up the story by saying, this is how we will tell of this incredible sin of mankind. And then we step out of the chorus and we sort of put on a mask. We represent the characters, but not completely playing them in the operatic sense.
Jesus ging mit seinen Jüngern über den Bach Kidron. Da war ein Garten, darein ging Jesus und seine Jünger.
Many evangelists, including myself, feel that you are actually the writer of the gospel. So in this case, I am St. John, the beloved disciple. With that in mind, you can read the narrative and create a backstory and a character profile, which kind of gives an added dimension to your performance. As for being a narrator, I think I can thank my mom for being my first teacher, because it's basically, when I was a child, she would read me stories and she would do different voices for different characters, and as an evangelist, you kind of have to do all of that, because you really have to show the emotion that is coming and emotion that has just happened, which means you also have to have lots of colors on your palette ready to sing with.
Judas aber, der ihn verrät, wusste den Ort auch, denn Jesus versammelte sich oft, da selbst mit seinen Jüngern.
For me, in my interpretation of Jesus, he is man and God. And so it had to be very emotional, declamatory, and immediate in a human sense. And it also had to be very godly and almost stolid.
Jesus antwortete, mein Reich ist nicht von dieser Welt. Wäre mein Reich von dieser Welt, meine Diener würden daran pennen, dass ich den Jüden nicht überantwortet würde. Aber nun ist mein Reich nicht verdammt.
There's no question what will happen. We've known for a long time that Jesus must be lifted up. This is the Gospel of John's way of talking about the crucifixion not as an ignominious moment, but as the first step in Jesus' return to God.
John is substantially different from the synoptics, right from the beginning of the gospel all the way to the end. Perhaps most noticeable, Jesus is in full control of his entire life. In effect, for John, Jesus orchestrates his own passion.
And so for Jesus to go to the cross isn't something the informed reader is hoping he'll somehow avoid. The reader knows it's his destiny. Jesus knows it's his destiny. And he approaches it all quite comfortably. It's a script. It's as if there's a script written for him, which he must carry out.
Als nun Jesus wusste alles, was ihm begegnen sollte, ging hinaus und sprach zu ihnen: Wen suchet ihr? Sie aber sprachen: Jesu, Jesu, Jesu von Nazareth, Jesu von Nazareth, Jesu von Nazareth.
When Jesus goes out to meet the cohort of 600 Roman soldiers that are trying to get him from the garden, instead of waiting to be seized, he says, "Whom do you seek?" And they cry out, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he says in the ancient Greek, "ego eimi," which are the words that God is depicted as having spoken to Moses from a burning bush that isn't consumed by the fire. I am, and that absolute usage of that word I am is understood as a theophany, a revelation of God's very presence.
Ich bin's.
But the way that Jesus sings that, he sings Ich bin's, just from a 5 to a 1 in the key of G major. And then when it comes to the part where Peter denies that he has anything to do with Jesus, he goes, Ich bin's nicht, which is a very convoluted, ornamented version of what Jesus had originally said, where he said Ich bin's, and Peter says Ich bin's nicht. And Bach is very aware of this and links these two passages together musically. The details of the Bible are extremely important to Bach. He himself, his own personal Bible, is heavily marked up with extremely detailed comments in Bach's own handwriting that show an almost fanatical devotion to the details of biblical criticism and text criticism and so on.
Take the F away. B, bum, D, ba, ba, bum, bum, bum.
As you're singing the Sterben, make sure it stays throughout the entire melisma. I'm getting Sterben. Each one stays. Always think a new vowel. Every note is the same vowel. Everyone is.
It was very helpful to have James Taylor, the voice instructor, come in. He has a lot of experience with German diction, and he was very clear about exactly how to shape all the vowels, which are so subtle.
Every time you sing one of those vects, you have to center right in on the pitch when you're singing the vowel. And the best way to do that, I know, is to think of the v as being on pitch. Vec, 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 vec.
It's absolutely essential to know what everyone is saying. And so that involved studying the libretto, memorizing the translation, not only for my part, but for Derek's part, and for the chorus, studying the gospel.
Often when I'm working with my singers, I like to use artwork to help the students identify with certain scenes in the Passion so they can understand more the kind of emotion that is behind a scene, the impact of the scene on perhaps an audience of the time.
I feel as though that the Passions kind of occur in a special dramatic time. It's not happening exactly in the presence. It's not a full story being retold or a full fleshed out narrative from the past, because it's interspersed with these contemporary commentaries, the chorales, the arias.
The St. John Passion has 3 layers. The one layer is the biblical narrative. The other layer is the reflection of the individual in the arias. And the third layer is the reflection and the reaction of the Christian congregation. And so the chorale settings kind of personify the reaction of the congregation in the Passion.
The chorales are very reflective, and the chorus becomes sort of a narrator. And the perspective of the chorus is really from Bach's time, the average churchgoer.
The chorales take us into the present. This is the congregation saying what they believe, what they know, struggling with the dilemmas, if there's a dilemma to be struggled with, speaking with confidence of what they know or believe the results to be. You've got that notion that I can both observe this action and I can comment on it and have this break from the action. And that's so extraordinary. And that's something that is not like any other kind of vocal dramatic work.
Most listeners nowadays get very excited about the arias, because that's what they think is going to be some exhibitionism sort of on the part of the soloists. And that they tend to be less interested in the chorales because they remind them of church, or they're kind of slow moving. And so they get this unhistorical notion that the exciting bits for Bach's listeners and for Bach himself would have been the arias, and that the chorales are just kind of thrown in there. But in fact, that's a very unhistorical way of understanding it. The chorales are the high point. Those are the tunes and the words that people know very well, that they sing at home around the table, that the mother sings to their children. The chorales are in the center of their lives, and they're very carefully chosen.
So in a sense, it really is the thread that links the entire thing together, because without the chorus, there'd be no opportunity for those chorales, which aren't actually a part of the action, but allow sort of Bach's theology and Lutheran theology and these other texts to take part in the biblical narrative.
Das Wort erfüllt würde, welches sagte, ich habe dir keinen verloren, die du mir gegeben hast. Da hatte Simon Petrus ein Schwert und zog es aus und schlug nach des hohen Priesters Knecht und hieb ihm sein recht Ohr ab. Und ihr Knecht ist Malchus. Da sprach Jesus zu Petrus:
Stecke dein Schwert in die Scheide. Soll ich den Kelch nicht trinken, den mir mein Vater gegeben hat? Den Kelch, den mir mein Vater gegeben hat.
In John's Gospel, Peter is somewhat of an also-ran. Because the figure of the beloved disciple is so prominent, Peter always comes in second place. They foot race to the tomb, but the beloved disciple gets there first and believes. Peter denies Jesus, the beloved disciple, stands at the foot of the cross.
When the risen Jesus appears, he asks Peter 3 times if he loves him. And with the third questioning, Peter weeps. And it's as if to say he's been reminded of his failure, of his denying Jesus 3 times.
If Peter, despite denying and failing and leaving the cross and running away, manages to become the leader of the church, heaven knows there's hope for the rest of us.
Although the person of Peter doesn't talk too much in the Passion, he is very important for the theological framework, because Peter is actually we. Peter is the believer, the person between confession and denial. And so he is the model of the Lutheran sinner. He is justified and he wants to believe, and at the same time he is too weak to believe.
Peter is a very difficult character for the choir member who has to sing him, because, of course, he has only a second to establish himself.
Sprach, ich bin's nicht.
Ich bin's nichts. That's all he gets to say.
The biggest sin that a human can commit, it seems, in the Gospel of John is not believing that Jesus has something to do with God the Father. And it's not, and in Lutheran thought, it's not just a matter of believing who Jesus is, but you must confess who he is. You don't just intellectually believe certain things about him, but you have to confess it. This would be a very meaningful spot to Lutherans in Bach's day, because what Peter is refusing to do is confess that he believes in Jesus, and that's a major sin.
A lot of his character is actually created through the evangelist in his descriptions of Peter, particularly when Peter finally realizes what he's done, when the cock has crowed, which we hear in a very vivid figure from the cello. And then the evangelist explaining that he cried, which is a remarkable, very extended melisma of great tortured pain.
The relationship between the biblical narrative and the reflection can be seen very well in one very small scene. When Peter follows Jesus, and then the aria follows, Ich folge dir gleichfalls mit freudigen Schritten. This is, of course, not Peter who is speaking. It is not Peter standing there and singing an aria, but this is the aria of the individual believer.
Ich folge dir gleichfalls mit freudigen We then associate this aria with Peter as we see his character. Everybody knows Peter as the one who denied Christ 3 times. So it's ironic, or perhaps very poignant, that Bach should take this music and reuse it later in the Passion in the aria Sei gegrüßet, and again in Schreibe nicht der Judenkönig.
I think this is a particularly wonderful aria because it happens after just one line of the evangelist. There's just a tiny little phrase that the evangelist sings, and Simon Peter followed him also. And suddenly you have this wonderful, quite innocent aria, I think, of the soprano being chased by these 2 flutes very vividly as they follow each other. One of the wonderful effects that Bach produces is to have the 2 flutes in unison, which means the breaths can be staggered, so it's a kind of flawless line that continues throughout the aria.
Oftentimes my aria is recorded or performed as if it's the frivolous, cheerful aria in the beginning before everything goes sour. And I think in preparing it, I decided that it wasn't intended to be a toss-off aria that's supposed to be pretty and simple. I think it's supposed to be more anticipating what kind of path I would have to follow in Jesus' footsteps. And it's not silly, it's pretty intense.
And the soprano has this wonderful part where she has this chromatic ascending passage, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, wonderful, where after all of this da-da-da-da-da, gentle stuff, she's got to push uphill on this chromatic line, and it's not as easy, perhaps. And I think right away, that character, the soprano who will weep at the end in Zerfließe, in another extraordinary aria, is experiencing for the listener the difficulty of this task of following, and the chromaticism does that.
We have the duality between this happy first part, this flowing melody when he talks about following, and the second part, the chromatic part, which depicts how hard it is actually to follow. And this second part gives a glimpse of what's going to happen. Peter and the believer still think, yes, we are able to follow Jesus. But the second half of the aria shows, no, there is something going to happen that makes it impossible for you to follow.